Samaria, which was the capital of the northern kingdom, was destroyed, 13,000 Israelis, most of them of the tribe of Ephraim, some of Manasseh, was taken out. 13,000. The population of the 10 tribes in the north, there are different opinions about this, but the population of the 10 tribes in the north was anywhere close to 4 or 5 million. Closer to 4 million people. So 13,000 of the people of Samaria was taken out. That's all. And then time went along, and then from the region of Gad and Manasseh, Gad, Reuben, and Manasseh on this side, mostly Gad, another 27,000 were taken out by the Assyrians. That was it. Very small percentage of the people of the northern kingdom was actually taken out. Not a very large amount of, minute percentage. Now, after Jerusalem was destroyed, and I think we talked about this before, we'll talk about it again. After Jerusalem was destroyed, then the Babylonians began to take portions of the priestly tribe and the people of Judah, the kingly tribes, and so the upper classes of Jerusalem off to Babylon. Then is when many of the people of the northern kingdom began to feel very insecure and began to go out on their own esteem, on their own accord. They began to literally leave the land of Israel to join the ones who had been taken out into the diaspora. Remember that the Assyrians and the Babylonians took mostly the leading classes, the priestly families, the royal families, and so on. And so the people felt as if their leadership had been stripped away from them. And when they began to see that, hey, you know, things are not getting better for us in the land of Israel, it became, you know, an attraction for them to leave the land of Israel. So by the time of Ezra and Nehemiah, you had a very active exodus of Israelis and Jews from the south leaving the land of Israel and going out to join the communities of the diaspora outside of Israel. Yes?
That God ordained for them to be dispersed. Why would these nations or cultures, why would they take 30,000, 60,000 people with them? Common sense would tell me, now you got to feed 60,000 people. What would be the reason for them taking them out?
Well, that's a good question. The reason is the Assyrians are the ones that began to practice this. It's a displacement plan. If you take a city, and they usually will go after city-states, but in the case with Israel, you know, Samaria was not a city-state. Samaria was the capital of the state of the northern kingdom. The idea of the Assyrians were to take a city, take, again, the leading classes, the leadership, and displace them as far away as they possibly could, and do the same to another city or city-state and take its leadership and export them, or I should say import them, into that other place that they had taken. And what does that do? It creates a balance, almost sort of a balance, where the people who had been conquered, whose leadership had been taken out, is not going to look at the disposed people for leadership. Right? They'll continue to trust on the empire, the kingdom that had conquered them. And that's the idea, to suppress them. If you take away the priestly class, there goes their spirituality, there goes their religion. Take away their kings, no one's leading. And so this was the practice of the Assyrians. The Babylonians practiced that as well. Now it was God again who ordained the diaspora. He warned Israel that this would happen if they would continue in sin. Someone do me a favor and check that air condition for me, please. I don't think it's on. If it isn't, we can turn it on. We're a little bit crowded tonight. That's good. So all of that, excuse me, all of that is to define for you why today we have the Jewish people and we have Kol Israel, all of Israel. So strictly speaking, the Jewish people are the people of Judah, Benjamin, and Levi who remained in the southern kingdom. The northern kingdom were all the 10 tribes of the north. Again, they were not lost. the vast majority of them chose to leave the land on their own accord and to join their communities outside of the land of Israel. There's one caveat here that I'll bring to mind here, and that is Tarshish. We've heard of Tarshish in the Bible. Tarshish is Iberia, Spain and Portugal, and some of Italy even. And Italy, France, Spain, Portugal was referred to as Tarshish or Sepharad. You've heard of the Sephardic Jews or Sepharad? But Sepharad is Tarshish, another name for Tarshish. Now, what we have in the book of Kings is that Solomon had the ships of Tarshish. There's a reference there in Kings chapter 19 or 18, I think it is, that Solomon had the ships of Tarshish. And once a year, the ships of Tarshish would return from Ophir. Anybody knows where Ophir was in biblical times? What country, what part of the world was referred to as Ophir? No. Close. No. India. So Solomon had the ships of Tarshish that would return with gold from Ophir and certain parts of Africa as well, the east coast, the west coast of Africa, and with ivory and all sorts of goods from that journey. It was a 3-year journey from wherever his ships would launch from. A 3-year journey by ship. So it's been concluded that Ophir, being India, and can also be considered parts of South Africa, Madagascar, India, the Indian Ocean, and India, that the ships of Tarshish sailed from Portugal, because Tarshish is Sepharad, the Iberian Peninsula. Any reasonable any reasonable source of history, any Jewish source of history, would give you that the Iberian Peninsula, for millennia, going all the way back to King Solomon, was covered with Jewish communities, especially around the coast of Iberia, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and even up to France. Even up to Britannia, which is France, into what became Britain. So those Sephardic communities had spread from Spain, Portugal, Italy, France, and into even England. And that's why Joseph of Arimathea came from Brittany, which, Brittany is France, but it's right across the aisle, right across the ocean from what we call England or Britain. So these communities were well established for millennia by the 2nd century, and they were established by Solomon, because Solomon had established this route, this shipping route that came from Iberia, Spain, Portugal, and went all the way to Ophir, India, and back to the land of Israel, bringing goods to the land of Israel. So again, the Jewish sources tell us that those communities had been there since the time of Solomon. So during the diaspora, and this is supported by Jewish sources, during the time of each one of these diasporas, Jews would go out and join the communities in Sepharad, Tarshish. Where did Jonah want to go once he realized that he had to deport from the land of Israel? Where did he want to go? Spain, Portugal, Tarshish. So it was sort of a pattern, an established pattern, that Jews, when they find themselves in trouble, they would sail westward towards Tarshish or Spain and Portugal. Now, Jewish sources are a bit tepid or careful about talking about this, even though it's all over their sources. It's recorded in their timelines that Sepharad had been a very strong and a very involved Jewish community since the time of Solomon. Most of Jewish sources of history are done by Ashkenazis. Ashkenazi Jews or European Jews. For whatever reason, there's a tension between the Institute of Ashkenazi Jewry and Sephardic Jewry. There's actually competition. It's an amazing thing, but they actually compete for prominence in their history. It's an amazing thing. So sources, Jewish sources that are pro-Ashkenazi will not put enough of an emphasis on the reality of Jewish life in the Iberian Peninsula. But Jewish life in the Iberian Peninsula was very strong, much stronger, especially before the Babylonian dispersion and 70 AD dispersion, much stronger than anything that existed in Babylon. The emphasis becomes Babylon because most of the Jews that were dispersed, most of the sons of Israel that were dispersed from the land of Israel, ended up initially in Babylon. But there was always a movement across North Africa and then across the Straits of Gibraltar into Iberia. That has always been a consistent pattern, a consistent path that the people of Israel had taken. Again, because Iberia was a haven for Jewish life. They prospered, they did very well in Iberia. They had absolute control of the Mediterranean. The Jewish people, the people of Israel, I should say, who lived in the Iberian Peninsula, were very strong maritime people. They were the cartographers, they were the ocean-faring people. They were. They absolutely were.
The intelligentsia, too.
They controlled the Mediterranean, absolutely controlled the Mediterranean. And so they were not a people who were on the defensive in Iberia. They were very, very involved. You know, if you study the Spanish language or the Romance languages of Iberia, you find that many of the words and the expressions that you have in the Romance languages are actually from a Hebrew source. They come from a Hebrew root. Many words in Spanish have Hebrew roots. And why is that? Because the Jewish people had been so entrenched, they were so entrenched in Iberia for so long, and they were a powerful people, very influential. They were involved in every king's court. They were courtiers in all of the kings of Iberia. Even in France, they were very much involved. And again, that is because they were well-founded. Their communities were well-founded in Spain and Portugal. So I say all of that to say that sometimes in Ashkenazi treatment of Jewish history, you don't have that emphasis. I'm going to put a lot of emphasis there over tonight and next Monday night because it belongs there. Not taking anything away from what happened with Babylon and the Jews that went north into Ashkenaz and became the Ashkenazi Jews, not taking anything away from them. But I think there's an injustice in Jewish history sometimes where not enough importance and emphasis is put on what happened with the Jewish communities in Iberia. Again, they were there since the time of Solomon. And they were not considered dispersed. They were considered communities functioning outside of the land of Israel on behalf of the land of Israel. Had always been their status. From the time of Solomon all the way up until actually the expulsion edict of 1492. They always saw, that's why many, many times you hear about the Sephardic diaspora, that Jews were dispersed from Spain. Why would they use that terminology, this Sephardic diaspora? Because Sepharad had become such, it was referred to in some cases as New Israel. Many, many times it's referred to in that same vein as New Israel. That's how important Sepharad was. The golden age of Judaism that gave us modern Judaism was established in Spain and Portugal, Sepharad, Iberia. So we'll talk more about that as we go along. So the Jews again became, the word Jew or the Jews became synonymous with all of the tribes of Israel, with Kol Israel, which I'm not sure if there's any justice in that. I much prefer to say the Jewish people, or to say the Jewish people or the Jewish nation, the people of Israel. Or I say sometimes the people of Israel, the Jewish nation. No doubt the leadership of Israel were in fact the people of the Jews, right? So the Jews, the people of Judah, Benjamin, and the Levites, they were the leadership. of Israel. And the Jews, again, became synonymous with all of Israel. There's a lot of conflict today, and there shouldn't be, about who are Jews, who are actually Jews, or who represents all of Israel. And you can understand why, because there were 3 diasporas, and they were very profound. Even though, again, the vast majority of the people of Israel left the land of Israel by their own free will because things had gotten difficult, even into the 586 diaspora with the Babylonians. Many of the people of Israel, the Jews in the south, left by their own volition because things had gotten that difficult. Now, the only diaspora, well, the one diaspora that wasn't very much that way was the diaspora of the Romans. The Romans went to war with all of Israel. They had a mission, they were on a campaign to dislodge and to dispose all of Israel. By the time the Bar Kokhba revolt came around, which is in 139 AD, the Romans had it up to here with the revolting Jews and had decided then that we must displace every last one of them. So they adopted a policy by which Israel, the nation of Israel, will no longer be Israel. It would be called Palestine. And thus, somehow, by calling the land Palestine, you take away the identity of Israel completely, because the objective was to remove every last son of Israel from the land, sort of plow it completely, and give it a new name, a new identity, which is what the Romans attempted to do, but it never did actually work. Because even during the process of the plowing of the land, Jews were constantly coming back. Every chance they had, they would sneak back in and again attempt to establish Jewish life in the land of Israel. So here you have it. So we know the difference between Israel and the Jewish people, right? There is ambiguity and confusion about that, but there really shouldn't be. Now, the 10 lost tribes, maybe we can talk about the 10 lost tribes a little bit. There is the idea of the 10 lost tribes of Israel, that those tribes are completely lost, and all we have are the 3 tribes in the south, which is in fact the Jewish people. That's entirely incorrect. Now, I'm not saying that every one of the 10 tribes of the north, every person, every Israeli of the 10 tribes of the north remained intact with Kol Israel, remained a part of all of Israel. That's not what I'm saying. Many of them assimilated and completely lost their identity. Absolutely, it absolutely happened. But not to the extent that we are told. You know, we're being told that, hey, the 10 lost tribes, they're lost, they're gone. Some people say they're gone forever. The people that would tend to lean more on faith, both Christian and Israeli Jews, would say that, no, they're not lost. God has tabs on them. God knows exactly where they are, and he will bring them back and restore them. And that's certainly true to a certain extent. But I want to say this. The people that we know as the Jews today are not all descendants of Judah, Benjamin, and Levi. Many are, but they're not all. Integrated into the Jewish people today, which is about 14 million people worldwide. That's a good number. I think that's the largest number of the people of Israel ever, perhaps. But ever since the diaspora of 70 AD, the Jewish people, or the people of Israel, had been a mixture of all of the tribes represented in the people that are called the Jewish people. Again, King Hezekiah opened the doors for the tribes from the north, and following that, you had an ingathering which involved all of the people of Israel. So the tribes that were dispersed, such as Manasseh. Why do I mention Manasseh? That map's not big enough for what I want to talk about, but why do I mention Manasseh? Manasseh was one of the first tribes to be taken out by the Assyrians. Just, 27,000 of the tribe of Manasseh, Gad, some of Reuben, were taken out and sent into the region that today called the Peshmergan trail way over here, across these mountains over here, in what was called the Parthian Empire. Now, eventually, more of the tribes of the north, like I've said, went out to join communities out here in Parthia, or the Parthian Empire. And the region, I'm talking really about the Silk Road. You know what the Silk Road is? The Silk Road? The Silk Road, right. The road, the highway, the path from Europe, effectively Europe, all the way to China. Well, the Jews, the Israelis, found themselves dotting that whole pathway all the way to China, and certain parts of it you find today, even today, you find people that are bearing significant Jewish markers today, and that's a study that's happening right now on that silk trade, the Silk Road. Today, even today, 20 years ago, an archaeologist by the name of Simcha Yakovovich did maybe about a 3.5-year study where he went to that same part of the world and interviewed people, whole communities of people, and he came back with the conclusion that much of the northern tribes are on that pathway all the way over to China. And that's why today you have the Beni Manasseh or Beni Manasseh movement in Israel, and they're all Oriental. They all look very Chinese, but they're sons of Manasseh, because Manasseh was that tribe that was initially taken out, and according to what we're hearing, found its way all the way out to China. The Silk Route, and then also in Nepal. They came down across the Himalayas and settled in Nepal. So the point is, the 10 lost tribes are not lost. Many of them are integrated into what we call the Jewish people, and many of them are actually out there. Most of them, I should say, the ones that are quote-unquote lost, are actually out there on that Silk Route, all the way over to China. And since Simcha Yakovovich did that documentary and did that incredible research about 20 years ago, 15 years ago, there's been much research ongoing, DNA testing, and it's all collaborating that these are in fact people of the tribe of Manasseh, Reuben, Gad, Asher, and many of the tribes that are so-called displaced are in that place, and they're actually still functioning as communities. So they're not lost, right? They're not lost. So when you combine that much of the Jewish people today are actually of the 10 lost tribes, together with the reality that preserved on that mountaintop all the way across to China, from effectively Turkey, which was ancient Babylon, to China, they're dotted across that whole area, and they've been preserved. They speak a dialect of Hebrew. They have Hebrew diets. It's an amazing thing. Israeli diets, and they're still there today. So what do you think? You think perhaps at some point in the future, God's going to hit a certain switch, and there's going to be a process of an ingathering from the Peshmergan Trail? What do you think? You think that's possible? I'll tell you this. This is what Simcha Yakovovich presented in his documentary, and you can find it on the internet. Much of the people that are northern Afghans are actually Israelites, ancient community of Israelites. And these are the ones who fought against the Khans, Kublai Khan, Genghis actually, not Kublai. These are the ones who fought against the Khans and were victorious against the Khans in many cases, fought against many armies, even the Russians, and even the United States of America, and has apparently prevailed against every army that has come against it. Yep. And Simcha is doing tremendous research now, and there is DNA work now that's beginning to indicate that these people are actually sons of Israel. Most of them of the tribe of Issachar, which is an amazing thing. Yes, go ahead.
The Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews, are they associated with certain tribes, like all Ashkenazi
That's a good question. The answer is complicated, but I'll try to answer it. The Ashkenazi Jews, they have their identity from the Jews that went to Babylon after the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, about 400 years or so in Babylon, and things got difficult, especially during the rise of Islam. And during that period, many of the Jews simply went from Babylon straight northwards. This map might tell us a little bit, give us some pointers. Yeah, Babylon in this area right here, after the advance of Islam, Muhammad did his thing. Many of the Jews simply crossed over this mountain range right here, Mount Ararat, that range there, and they simply went up next to the Caspian Sea and went straight north and encountered the region of the Ashkenaz king. And the Ashkenaz king heard a lot about the Jewish people, how effective they were at, money taxing and so on, and they were good for his kingdom. So he decided that he was going to embrace their faith, Judaism. Now, he's an Ashkenaz, a king, and the Ashkenaz were Nordic peoples. They were not Anglo, but they were Nordic, some race of Nordic people. Very Nordic features. Blonde hair, red hair in many cases, and very light-colored skin. And he decided that his entire kingdom would become Jewish. So he passed a decree across his entire kingdom, which was a substantial kingdom, that everyone in his kingdom would become Jewish. And, of course, that also welcomed more Jews from Babylon. I'm talking about in the 5th to 7th century after Islam came into power. And there was a lot of political jostling happening because the Jews were known for being excellent warriors and weapon makers. They were known to be makers of excellent weapons. And, in fact, Muhammad used them for their sword forging. They were some of the best sword forgers and forgers of spears at that time in the world. And Medina was, at one point, Medina was a Jewish town, more or less. The whole region of Medina was a Jewish town. And when Muhammad did his thing, he used them to gain manufacturing of swords and technology from them. And once he had utilized and he had received what he wanted, he decided to turn against them, forcibly convert them. And in fact, in Iberia, Spain and Portugal, you have the name Medina, a very common Spanish name. It's actually pointing to the Jews who fled from Medina and went to Iberia. So you can say effectively that all of the Spanish people with the last name Modena, and even Molina is a derivative of it, have their history in Medina, right? So that's another part of history that we'll talk about perhaps between now and next week. Now, to answer your question, the Ashkenazi Jews became sort of a fusion between the small population of actual Jews, descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, that traveled north, and mostly a Nordic people, and they interfused together, they intermarried, and that became the basis for the Ashkenazi people. No. Some of the people that went north with the Jewish people were probably from the northern tribes, but many of them were actually Jews from Judah. You see, at that point, you're talking the 5th, 6th century, it didn't really matter. There was, again, a fusion between all the tribes, and they all became known as the Jewish people. It's an amazing thing because Simcha Yakovovich, in his research, discovered that some of those tribes that went far out east on the Silk Route refused to be called Jews. I should bring the documentary and you should look at it. They refused to be called Jews because they said flat out, we are not Jews, we're Israelites. And one tribe said that we are of the tribe of Issachar, we're not Jews. And even these people that have been there for millennia, two and a half millennia almost, are making that distinction clear, even today, and they're there. Now, there's been many movements of aliyah from these regions. Lots of rabbis got involved in this with an effort to bring them back to the land of Israel. And this is a very, very active movement even now as we speak. So it's a fascinating history, and I don't know enough to speak completely intelligently about it, but I know more about the Sephardic history because that's been my thing. But the Ashkenazis are actually an amalgamation, I hate to use the word amalgamation, but a fusion between Nordic peoples and actual Jewish people. That movement was so powerful because you had a European or an Anglo, not Anglo, but a Nordic king who gave authority, actually, to build his kingdom and for it to be Jewish. Ultimately, Genghis Khan would sack most of that kingdom and forced it even further north and west. Because we must study a little bit about Genghis Khan. Genghis Khan had a lot to do with the movement of people from that area into Europe, Western Europe, because when the Khans came over, Genghis and his son Kublai, they pushed everything on that silk trade, on that route, westward, destroyed and pushed everything westward. So the Jewish people who got caught up in that, they were quick to be removed. So many of them filtered into further north into Russia and even back east into Russia and into Europe. So then the Ashkenazi movement became more European. And we're talking about the movement of the Khans, and that's in the 12th century. You know, Genghis Khan began his conquest of the world somewhere in the 12th century. So, for that reason now you have a distinction between the European Jews, referred to as Ashkenazi Jews, but I want to tell you something. And the Ashkenazi counterparts, or the people that will disagree with this, would tell you that there's a clear distinction between the Ashkenazi Jews and Sephardic Jews, and that distinction has always been made, and that line has always been clear, but that's not true. Because after 1492, the expulsion edict, many of the Jews from Sepharad, Iberia, went north and east into Holland, Germany, even as far as some even ended up in Russia to join communities out there. So the point is, many of the Sephardic Jews who had to flee Spain and Portugal ended up becoming Ashkenazi Jews. I'll give you an example. Rabbi Wallman, his wife, considers herself an Ashkenazi Jew. But she was here one time and she asked me, she said, you know, your daughter looked Jewish, you look Jewish, are you Jewish? And I said, well, my ancestry is Jewish, I'm not Jewish. She said, where were your ancestors from? I said, Madeira, Portugal. She said, oh, that's where my people came from, Madeira, Portugal. The key is that her people fled Madeira, Portugal, and went northwards, whereas my people stayed there and became Roman Catholics. So her ancestors, the ones that fled, went northwards and into Holland and ultimately into Germany and became known as Ashkenazi Jews. But they're actually originated in Sepharad, in Spain and Portugal. Now, my counterparts on the other side of this argument would disagree, or they would not successfully disagree because they know it's true, but they will downplay, they would minimize the argument and say, well, that's not many of them did, but it's not true because many of the German Jews, and this is based on research that's been established, many of the German Jews before the Holocaust were actually originated in Spain and Portugal. And they had very Sephardic features and not Ashkenazi features. When you encounter the Ashkenazi Jew, the quintessential Ashkenazi Jew, they have very light features, right? You do see some Semitic resemblances, some Semitic features, but mostly you see people that, hey, that guy can pass for Tom's brother, right? The true Ashkenazi Jew. Now, many of the European Jews, even Western and Eastern European Jews, did not have that appearance. They had very Semitic appearances. You know, the nose, the features that are quintessential, quote-unquote, Jewish. And that's because many of them originated from Spain and Portugal. Also, you have the Mizrahi Jews, who stayed in the Middle East, in Iraq. What was Babylon but became Iraq, in Iran, in Yemen, in Turkey, that never actually went out further than those places. They're called the Mizrahi Jews, and they are quintessential Semitic peoples. No Anglo features at all, or no Nordic features at all. They're very much like the Sephardic people in appearance. And that's because their lineage is more pure to the actual people of the land of Israel. Today you have the Black Israelite movement. You've heard about it. You've heard about that, right? So it's a very unfortunate movement because it's completely lost. That's right. There's no basis in their argument, but they're very fervent and they're almost militant about their opinions, which is unfortunate because they have the ability to impress that upon people and convince people that what they're saying is true because they're so militant. You know, I would argue a point fervently. My voice would become shrill sometimes because I'm passionate, but I won't try to force something on someone. Well, the Black Hebraic movement or the Black Hebrew movement, they are militant, and it's very unfortunate. But there's no basis for their argument because you can find a very clear track of lineage going back in time to a people that was very Semitic in appearance and not Africana in any way at all. Were there Cushite people or Africana people blended in to the people of Israel? Of course. That had always been the case. Moses married a Cushite woman, right? And it was such an issue that his sister Miriam had a problem with the fact that he married a Cushite woman and began to speak out against him. So there was clearly some racism there, but Moses' wife was a Cushite. Now, I'll just put this out here right now, and this is for research. Someone can research it. Moses' wife, Zipporah, was a Midianite, right? She was not a Cushite. The Midianites are descendants of Abraham. So she was a Semitic woman, probably different in feature than the people of Israel, because the sons of Midian were Ishmaelites. The Ishmaelites began to marry surrounding peoples, but surrounding peoples, who were, many of them were Aramean in descent, and some were what we call Arabs. But the Arabs were actually the Ishmaelites. So the Midianites were Arabs. Moses married Zipporah, who was a Midianite. Zipporah began the journey back to Egypt with Moses, but along the way something happened. Who remembers what happened? A strange interlude, that's a good way of putting it. It was much more than a strange interlude. There was an abrupt interruption in their marriage. What happened? She seemingly turned away from Moses. She went back to Midian. Right? So when Moses now, after the children of Israel had come out with Moses, he went back to Jethro in Midian, and Jethro says, here's your wife. So what happened? She wasn't in favor of him circumcising her two sons. You know how moms can be. Her sons were adults. They were married for 40 years. And Moses is going into Egypt with his two adult sons, and God is pressing him to circumcise them. And Moses was, obviously he was withholding. Why? Because finally God said, this is the interlude, God said, okay Moses, you say it. God said to Moses, someone say it, what did God say to Moses about his two sons? If you don't do it, Moses, effectively, I'm going to choose someone else for the job. Remember that? We talked about it. God said he was going to kill Moses. Get him out of the way because you're not faithful here. I have a mission for you. In other words, you are going to be the lawgiver for all of Israel, and you don't want to circumcise your children? You're disqualified, Moses. Finally, Moses debated the issue with Zipporah to the point where Zipporah did what? She grabbed a stone, a flint stone, and she circumcised her adult sons herself and flung the remains at Moses and said what to Moses? You are a bridegroom, you're a husband of blood to me. Turns around and goes back to Midian. Now, as Moses comes out of Egypt, I'm going somewhere with this, somewhere worthwhile. So this happens on the way down to Egypt. The Exodus must have taken about 2 years, the whole process, perhaps. Moses comes back out of Egypt with a Cushite wife, not a Midian wife. So what's the conclusion? Zipporah went back to Midian. Zipporah was a Midian. She was a Midian woman. She wasn't Cushite. So the conclusion is Moses took a Cushite wife. His wife left him, went back to Paps, went back to Jethro. Moses is in Egypt, took a Cushite wife, an African wife. And what happened? That created a big stir. Created a big stir because even Aaron stood with Miriam. As they said, this is not working. He has a Cushite wife. How can he lead the people of Israel? We're leaders of Israel, is what Miriam said. Because of the Cushite wife. That creates a pressure, right? A pressure that you don't talk about much when you talk about Bible stories, but it's there. Again, Zipporah was a Midianite, a Midianitess. Probably looked very much like Abraham or Ishmael, and he took a Cushite wife. The word Cushite is a very clear identifier for the people of Africa. So ponder that for a moment. And of course, there was racism in the whole process. But the point is, there has always been a mixture of people from without the sons of Abraham that would mix and blend together with the people of Israel, and the mass of the Semitic people of Israel would absorb them. It has always been the case. And that's why if you look at the Jewish people, the sons of Israel today, from the Mitzrahi and the Sephardic, you see different tones. You see the traces that there are different peoples mixed into the people of Israel, which is fine, which is what the people of Israel is all about. 2,000 years of diaspora, and you're going to be mixed with other peoples. But the whole Ashkenazi pressure, the pressure of the Ashkenazi Jew. You see, the Ashkenazi Jew won the argument in the West about who is the Jew. The Sephardic Jews, who had become Ashkenazi Jews, were on the side of the Ashkenazi argument. But the Sephardic Jews, who went to North Africa and to the Far East, Yemen, they became very marginalized and very quiet. Their opinions became less influential. And so the history of the Sephardic Jews is very oppressed almost. Again, there was a time in the history of the Jewish people that Sepharad, Spain and Portugal, was a new Israel and held up. The golden age of Judaism is that 400-year period of Sephardic Jewry. And Solomon had established the communities over there, yeah. And following 70 AD, I'm jumping around here, but I'm going somewhere. Following 70 AD, after the Jews, people of Israel, a mixture of Jews and sons of Israel, left the land of Israel, 70 AD. Now remember, 70 AD wasn't the complete action on the part of the Romans. 70 AD is when they destroyed and took Jerusalem. Before then, and at that time, they were suppressing all of the cities of Judah and in the north. but the process of diaspora or dispersion hadn't begun until following 70 AD. It was after the Bar Kokhba revolt that the Romans, like I said earlier, said enough. We're going to push all of them out. So after the Bar Kokhba revolt, 200 AD, and Josephus, Flavius Josephus, the great historian, wrote about this in his account that after 200 AD, after the Bar Kokhba revolt, Jews began to be pressed out of the land, and many of them did not go to Babylon. Why? Because the Romans, who were in the Parthian region of Parthia, because Rome had been fighting a war with the Parthian Empire for 150 years before. Rome was very strong in this area right here, so the Jews would not go to Babylon after the Bar Kokhba revolt. Why? Because they would encounter the Romans. At this point in the history of Israel, the Jewish people were anathema, hated, dreaded by the Romans, to be killed, to be destroyed. So the Jews, after the Bar Kokhba revolt, did not readily go east and north. They went west. Most of them went west along into Egypt and along the African north coast. Their goal was not to remain on the north coast of Africa. Their goal was to get to the Straits of Gibraltar or some other port like Tunis and cross over into the safe haven of Italy, Spain, Portugal, France, Britannia, which they did. So many of the Jews who fled after Rome, Bar Kokhba revolt, ended up in North Africa and into Europe, Spain and Portugal, and then ultimately, after the expulsion edict, many of them went east and north, further into Europe. So again, to answer the question, and I'm still going on the question, today's Sephardic people are closer to the actual sons of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob than the Ashkenazi people. And that's a powerful thing to say, and in some circles, I would be pelted with rotten tomatoes for saying this. In some circles, I would be touted as a hero for being brave enough to say it. But it's absolutely true. If you speak to a Sephardic Jew in Israel today who is passionate about his history and his heritage, he would support that fully. In fact, he would be fully comfortable with what I said because he would know it's true. And he would see the Ashkenazis as outsiders, newcomers who had sort of hijacked their identity. And that's amazing, right? And the reason that Ashkenazi Jewry has become so powerful is because it has been westernized. It has been westernized and accepted as Jewry. All right, so Ashkenazi Jews, nonetheless, they are Jews. A Jew is someone who practices the religion of Israel. You can be a Cushite. You can be, as in the case with the people of Manasseh, you can be Oriental. You can be Indian, as with the people of Issachar. If you follow the Jewish religion, you are a Jew. To have Jewish ancestry is useful, important, because it means that your lineage goes way back. And in many cases, that lineage is accompanied by cultural norms. And the cultural norms strongly identify with the people of Israel. It's an amazing thing. The documentary by Simcha Yakovovich, the naked archaeologist he's called, the documentary that he did 20 years ago, 15 years ago, he interviewed a community in Afghanistan who identified themselves as of the tribe of Issachar. And they were there since 200 years. They were there in the same environment. They survived the Khans, they survived the Russians, they survived us, and they're still in that area. Very, very distinct community of people. They are very much Israeli. He went and visited them when they were making matzah, unleavened bread. And the women were baking the unleavened bread, and they were saying, this is the way it was done in Samaria. and in Jerusalem when we were there. And that's the type of language that they use. When we were there, and they're talking about 2,200 years ago, this is how we made matzah, and she was illustrating how they did it. And they were singing songs in a very Akkadic language, a very Akkadic Aramean, Hebrew language, and they were rejoicing over the matzah that they were making in preparation for Pesach. And this is a people that had been isolated since then, firmly believe that they are the tribe of Issachar, and they are not Jews, and they will tell you that they are not Jews. So that gives us a bit of a foundation now for the actual lecture. Any questions? No, this is good, and I think this is a very important topic, and Caesar's recommendation that we take it over into next week where I can get the presentation done for you is a good one. Yes.
So the 10 Lost Tribe movement is under the belief that they are the lost tribes and that the people in Israel are not the real Jews. Like, I don't get.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Like, what's the point? So, but in reality, there's more Jews in Israel than are out of Israel right now.
Today, for the first time since the time of Jesus, you have more, the people of Israel, synonymously Jews, in the land of Israel than outside of the land of Israel. And this is the first time it's been that way since Yeshua, which is a good sign. We like that, right? More than half of the people of Israel, the Jewish nation, is in the land of Israel. It's never been like this since the time of Jesus. Again, a clear indicator that we're approaching a very significant time. And it's a long-standing Jewish concept that when the 10 lost tribes do in fact return to the land of Israel, it will be followed by an apocalypse. Simcha Yakovovich, and you should all see that documentary, I recommend it. In Search of the 10 Lost Tribes is the name of the documentary. In Search of the 10 Lost Tribes. Simcha Yakovovich. How would you spell it? Your guess is as good as mine. He's a naked archaeologist, yeah. Don't worry, he never appears naked. But you see, the point is, in his documentary, he illustrates so clearly how these people are not Jews, but they are descendants of the 10 lost tribes, and they don't consider themselves to be Jews. They consider themselves to be cousins, to be related, to be one people with the Jewish people, but they're not considering themselves to be Jews because they've been isolated during that period of time when the Jewish people, the sons of Judah, and the 10 tribes in the north became the same people and known as the same people. The point is, God is able to preserve the 10 tribes, and he has done that with the Jewish people. Now, I would say this for sure, that after 70 AD, that movement of sons of Israel, actually after the Bar Kokhba revolt, that movement of people that were pushed out of the land and into Egypt, North Africa, ultimately into Spain and Portugal, were mostly Jews. Mostly Jews. And why would I say that? Because the cities of Judah were the strongholds against the Romans. They were the ones who planted their feet and say, we're not going, you're going to have to fight us out of here. Because the people of Judah were more fervent. The people of Judah said, we are the Maccabees. We stood up against the Romans, the Grecians. We are the fervent ones. We are the overcomers. We're not moving. So Rome mounted up a tremendous force and ultimately had to push the people of Judah out from the land of Judah in Jerusalem. And they ended up in Sepharad. So most of the Sephardic Jews, or a good percent of the Sephardic Jews, are actually descendants of Judah. They're actually Jews, Benjaminites and Levites. Some of the strongest Sephardic families, like the Abravanels, one of the strongest Sephardic families, the Abravanels, very strong. Well, they are actually descendants of David. And they've maintained that that connection to King David all the way up until today. Until today. A few years ago, the Antichrist was a Spanish prince or king or something. You remember that? Those of us that's been around as Christians for a long time, do you remember back in the 1980s, some Spanish king was going to be the Antichrist? One something. And why is that? Because he's related to the Abravanels. And according to their ideology, the Antichrist has to have Jewish royalty blood to be the Antichrist. So King Juan, whatever he was, you can look him up, Spanish Antichrist.
Carlos of Spain?
That guy. He was going to be the Antichrist because he was related to the Abravanels, King David. So naturally, he would be the Antichrist. A false Christ, and that's the point. The Messiah had to be related to King David in order to be a false Christ. But the Abravanel family was very strong throughout Spain and Portugal. It is rumored, now this can't be proven, of course, because history has been so shrouded and so interfered with, that Columbus was related to the Abravanel family because the Fernandezes, which is his real last name, Fernandez, had changed their name from Abravanel to Fernandez. And so it's believed that Columbus was related to this powerful Sephardic family, the Abravanels. Possibly so, I don't know. So you see, it's interesting, right? It's very interesting that we have this history today that's almost being completely set apart. The history of Columbus, which I guess at some point we'll talk about more so. The history of Columbus himself. Christopher Columbus, however you say his name in Italian. Doug's not going to like this because I'm going to basically claim that Columbus was actually Portuguese. And he was. At the monastery or at the cathedral in Genoa where he signed his name, he did not sign his name Christopher Columbus. You can go there today and see it, the actual signature, the copies of it at museums in Genoa. And he signed his name Salvador Fernandez Zacor. Zacor. And that was his actual name and changed to Christopher Columbus. Well, Salvador Fernandez Zacor, sometimes it's Salvador Zacor Fernandez, it depends on which Portuguese historian you're talking to, but Salvador Fernandez Zacor is a very Portuguese name. In fact, it's Madeiran. He grew up on the island of Madeira. Now, conventional history will tell you that as a teenager, he was sent to Madeira to learn about the trade winds. That's conventional history. So he suddenly appears in Madeira under the name of Christopher Columbus, an Italian, supposedly. What they don't tell you is that he grew up on the island of Madeira, went to Genoa, took a Christian name, and came back with a new identity to Madeira, where he began to sail with the Portuguese fishermen who were sailing the trade winds to the western part of this continent. What were they sailing? What were the fishermen doing coming over here from Madeira? Why Madeira? Madeira was a stopping point for the trade winds. If you look at the island of Madeira, just about 200 or 300 miles west of Madeira, you have the trade winds. And you can literally pick it up there, and it will swing you north and west and take you into the Americas. The Portuguese, well, actually, the Sephardic Jews of Madeira and Portugal have been fishing the east coast of this country for 1,500 years, some historian says. For a very long time, they've been fishing the east coast of this country, from Nova Scotia all the way down to the Carolinas. And they've been making that trip for that long. How long, if you research now, this is interesting, if you research bacalhau, who knows what bacalhau is? You know what bacalhau is? Salted fish, right? Codfish. Bacalhau is not any salt fish. right? You can't just take a snapper and salt it and cure it in the sun and say it's bacalao. No, it's salted snapper.
Isn't it cod?
Bacalao is codfish. Bacalao, the word bacalao literally means in Ladino, not even in Portuguese, in Ladino. Ladino is the language of the Sephardic Jews. Bacalao in Ladino literally means the friendly fish. Friendly fish. And that's codfish. So they've been, now the Mediterranean. Okay, let's talk about the Mediterranean. The Jews have been sailing the Mediterranean in Phoenician ships since Solomon. Solomon had the ships of Phoenicia, ships of Tarshish. They were Phoenician ships. He gained the technology, the maritime technology that he had. He didn't have it. The Jews were never a people of the sea. He gained it as king from the Phoenicians, who were Grecians, right? And then suddenly the Jewish people, being the type of people that they were, they capitalized on that. And suddenly they are governing the Mediterranean by the 5th century AD. What did they do? They began to merchandise fish from the West. It was said that codfish was in such abundance off the east coast of this country that you can literally park up there and cast and drop seine nets and catch them by the thousands at that period. And so these Jews, being as enterprising as they were sailing across on the trade winds, coming over here and filling their galleons. And they went in ships 3-4 at a time, just as Columbus sailed. 3-4 ships at a time would sail out from Madeira, which is where Portugal, Columbus sailed from. But this is what they've been doing for millennia. Sail out from Madeira, get on the trade winds, harness all the incredible codfish, bacalao, salt it on the deck of their boats, and make the trip back to Europe and flood the market in the Mediterranean with bacalao. Every port in the Mediterranean offers bacalao in their menus. Every one, even as far as Armenia. You can get bacalao dishes in Greece. I've researched this. You can get bacalao in Tunisia, the North Africa. You can get it in Alexandria. Why? Because the Jewish people had been flooding the Mediterranean Ocean with it for millennia. So Columbus literally went to Genoa, took on an Italian name, a Christian name, a Catholic name, came back to Madeira, where he grew up, and sailed with the fishermen as a teenager to the Western Hemisphere. He knew it was there all along. He didn't think it was China. He knew that there was a continent there between China and Europe. Why do you think Bartholomew Diaz went south and east? To Bartholomew Diaz, the navigator who was just around the time just before Columbus, who discovered the Cape of Good Hope, and India by the ocean. Well, he didn't discover it. They knew it all along. They knew it all along.
They didn't want everybody else to find it.
That's right. It was to be kept. And Bartholomew Diaz was only recognized as the one who discovered the Orient by sea after the Spaniards had gone west. You see, so the Jewish people are by no means naive. They're very clever people. So here is the whole scenario. The Abravanel, who was in the court of a courtier, like I said before, in the court of King Ferdinand and Isabella. 3 Jews were in the court of Ferdinand and Isabella, and they worked in tandem to convince Ferdinand and Isabella to go west to get to the east. And she finally bit. And they said, well, we have the perfect navigator here for you. Young man, he knows the sea. He's fished the continent over there. He'll take you right to it. And of course, they were lifting up Columbus because Columbus was, in fact, a Jew, a crypto-Jew, a secret Jew. And of course, on the same month that the expulsion edict occurred, 1492, Columbus sailed west with 3 galleons, just as they would normally do, to the Western Hemisphere to supposedly discover the Orient. No, they all knew it wasn't the Orient because the Portuguese had been sailing the Orient for millennia, since the time of Solomon, the ships of Tarshish. So you see, the Jewish people, they've always had a way of harnessing information, just utilizing important information. Zakoto, who invented what's that thing called for navigation? You know that device? Yeah. What's it called? The sextant, right. Sextant. That sextant had been around. He renovated it. He created a more smoothly running sextant. Zakoto was one of the people that interacted with Columbus when he was a child. Zakoto is the guy that literally trained Bartolome Diaz and Vasco da Gama. Vasco da Gama was the navigator again that started making frequent trips from Portugal, Madeira to be specific, to India and back after Bartolome Diaz. So you see, the scheme is that Columbus, under the guidance of the 3 Jewish courtiers, sent the Spanish crown on a wild goose chase looking for the Orient in the West. They very well knew that it wasn't here. So the Spaniards got over here thinking, okay, this is the Orient, and lo and behold, it's not the Orient. While the Portuguese won the race, won the competition, they always had. And so if you look up any conventional historic source, who won the race for the Orient? Well, the Portuguese did. The Portuguese had a scheme placed upon King Ferdinand and Isabella, and Columbus was an important part of that whole scheme. He led them to the West. All right, so question.
I just have one quick question about codfish. So, because that's a really clue. So you can't get codfish in the Mediterranean?
Oh yes, today it's
Let me make in the water.
no.
Codfish is known for
One part of the globe only, which is the eastern coast of the United States of America up into Greenland. Codfish. You don't get them anywhere else. In fact, you can get them. I've caught a codfish off of Cape Canaveral. Nice one. But you don't get them frequently anymore because they're fished out. There was a time the entire eastern coast of this continent was flooded, silly with codfish. They were a nuisance fish. But wonderful fish. The quality of the codfish is great. And the Portuguese, the Jewish people loved it. Loved it, especially when it's salted. And you can preserve it for literally for years. You can have a barrel of codfish in your garage for years before you eat it. Yeah, I grew up in a Portuguese home. I know about it. You know, my dad used to take me to one of his distant cousins, and they were Mendez's. When I was a kid, we used to go to the Mendez's house, and that guy used to fish. And he used to salt his fish, not codfish, you don't get that in Trinidad. And you go to his house, and on the roof of the house, he has laid out fish. Fish, salting. And he would salt them after months of salting them, he'd stack them away, and they would literally be stored away forever. Just about. So codfish, the friendly fish, bacalao, the friendly fish, has a lot to do with the Jewish history and the discovering of this continent. Literally, this continent, from a certain perspective, owes its existence to codfish. Eventually, it would have been discovered and conquered, eventually, but that was the whole impetus behind Columbus being the one chosen to lead that venture, that deception of the Western world being the Eastern world, and he succeeded. You know, Columbus, I've told you this before, Columbus on his 5th journey was arrested. We all know that. Yeah. But is it clear what he's been arrested for? What he had been arrested for? He was accused of being a Judaizer. A Judaizer. A Judaizer. He was accused of many things, but mainly the Inquisition wanted to sit him down and talk to him about why are there Jewish communities cropping up in Cuba, Hispaniola, even in Florida, St. Augustine. Why are there Jewish communities cropping up wherever you go? Are you doing something that you're not supposed to do? Now, they brought charges against him, but the real issue was he was accused of being a Judaizer. Of course, he was doing it. He was doing it. But he was so important to the crown of Spain, that they couldn't set him in an auto de fe. They couldn't trial him. He was far, far too important. Yes?
Oh, I'm going to say the Chinese now are trying to make another silk road and trying to do that highway. And also, did Columbus didn't know that he was being used to
He was a spy.
No, the Portuguese writers now.
Since the 1990s, has been free to write on the subject of Fernandez Zaco, more liberally, and they're coming out and giving the actual oral history in written form, and absolutely, Columbus was a Sephardic Jew who was working on behalf of the Crown of Portugal that was also being influenced by Jewish courtiers to provide safe havens for the Jewish people that were being dispersed. Again, at the same month that the expulsion edict was declared, in the same month, June of 1492, Columbus sailed. July, he sailed the exact same month. This was all set up by the three courtiers in the court of Isabella and Ferdinand. So, effectively, Spain was snookered. They were taken by the Portuguese, by the Jewish Portuguese. Of course, by the time Spain realized that that was happening, they weren't happy. By the time they realized that that had happened, they had already began to look for what in the new continents? Gold. They were furious. Absolutely, they were furious. And so the next thing for them to do, they didn't win the war, the race with the spice. They didn't gain the spice of the East like they wanted to. So what was left? Destroy the Mesoamerican communities and take whatever they had. Convert them by the sword.
Yeah.
Listen, the first 20 years of the conquistadors, the first 20 years of the Spaniards in Central America and North, South America was horrible. I think in the first 15 years, 20 million of these people perished. They realized that these people were susceptible to viruses from Europe, and they purposely brought the viruses in, massacred vast numbers of them in the name of Jesus. But it was really about the Spaniards losing their minds over the fact that the Portuguese had duped them and they had to steal the gold. And there's an interesting history now that's coming out that has to do with the pirates of the Caribbean. It's interesting. It's funny. Many of the pirates of the Caribbean were Sephardic Jews. Many of them were. Many of them were Sephardic Jews. Most of them Portuguese, who had a real problem with Spain. Remember now, when Portugal began to forcibly convert their Jews in 1497, most of the Jews who had the means, like Dona Mendez, we talked about Dona Mendez Nassi, right? She was Madeiran, Portuguese Jew. She had the means to take many of her people, her countrymen, out from Madeira and give them safe haven in Holland. And from Holland, many of them went over into other parts of Europe. So you had this movement of Sephardic Jews from Portugal who went to Northern Europe and literally gave maritime technology to the Dutch. The Dutch were never a seafaring people. Never. The Dutch were probably descendants of the Vikings to some, but they were never a seafaring people. They didn't have that technology. That technology was granted them by the Sephardic Jews who were being displaced from Portugal and Spain even. But what happened? Many of these people became privateers. Determined to exact revenge upon the Spanish crown, joined British ships and Dutch ships and formed alliances with these ships, with these movements, and went against the Spaniards. A lot of the privateer movement against the Spanish galleons, literally sinking them and taking all their gold, was Jewish, Sephardic Jewish. There was a plot behind it. This is history that's now coming out. It involves the island of Jamaica. It involves the island of, it's a fascinating history that's seeping out right now. If you go to Jamaica, there are many synagogues, not so much anymore, but there used to be many synagogues in Jamaica with sand for its floor. There's still a few of them that's left. What's the point to having a synagogue with sand on the floor? No? This is a tradition that actually goes back to Portugal. Because the Jews that settled in Jamaica were Portuguese Jews who came from Brazil, Recife, Pernambuco, Brazil, after they were pushed out by the Roman Catholics. The idea of having sand on the floor of the synagogue is so that you do not make noise. In the heydays of the Marranos movement, the crypto-Jewish movement, these crypto-Jewish people had to survive in the midst of Roman Catholic communities. And so they would have synagogues set up in their own homes, in back rooms. And in order to prevent their Roman Catholic, or their new Christian neighbors, or the Roman Catholic neighbors, from knowing what was happening, they would put sand on the ground so they don't make noise. You know, we walk on nice tile floors, we don't have to worry about making noises, but in the ancient world, you had 20 people in a room, your neighbors are going to know. So the whole concept of having a sand floor goes back to Madeira, Portugal, Lisbon, and Spain, that came over to the New World by the Sephardic Jews, Pernambuco, Brazil, and from Pernambuco, Brazil, it went from Pernambuco, Brazil to Canaan. You know where Canaan is? Guyana, French Guyana, Canaan, and to Suriname, and to British Guyana, to certain parts of the Caribbean, Tobago, Curacao, Aruba, and then ultimately Jamaica. Jamaica was on the end part of that progression. Some of the Sephardic Jews from Portugal, Brazil, up the islands and so on, also went to Cuba. Also went to Cuba from Jamaica. You can see the hub. But Jamaica is an important island when it comes to the Pirates of the Caribbean and the Sephardic connection. And it's a fascinating story. There's a story about Port Royal. You know the story of Port Royal. What's Port Royal? It was a pirate town.
In those times it was
a very, very successful pirate. It was rich. Port Royal sat on a quay, outcropping of the part of the island of Jamaica, like a quay. Very sandy. And they had an earthquake somewhere in the late 1600s. They had an earthquake. And the entire quay of Port Royal, the city of Port Royal, sank into the ocean. Right? So you can look that up. You can go to Jamaica today. There are diving teams that will take you out there, and you can dive into Port Royal and see all the streets and all the buildings and everything, just sitting under the sea. Fascinating story about Port Royal. Port Royal was a pirate town. Everyone knows that. Pirates of the Caribbean. You know, that movie that with whatever his name is about Port Royal. The whole movie is about Port Royal before it sinks into the ocean. Well, the Jews of Portugal that went from Madeira, took the sugarcane industry from Madeira to Pernambuco, Recife, Brazil, and began to produce sugar there. For the first time ever, they invented a sugar mill. On the island of Madeira, they had one, but nothing like what they invented in Pernambuco. Why? Think about it. What ran the sugar mill?
What is around sugar?
What ran it? What was the source of power for a sugar mill?
Slaves.
Water. No, water. They didn't have the luxury of slaves. Pardon that statement. Water. They need a strong source of water. Madeira didn't have that. It's a little island in the ocean. Madeira is where the sugarcane industry was invented in the 1200s. The Sephardic Jews, the Fernandezes, the Peristellas, Christopher Columbus's wife. Conventional history tells you that she was a Jew who gleefully converted to Catholicism. Not so at all. She was forcibly converted. Well, the Peristellas, the De Sousas, and all of the Portuguese on the island of Madeira, they had invented the sugarcane industry. And they began to sell sugar to Europe. For the first time ever, sugar came on the scene. Didn't exist. They took the cane plant from Africa. What the Jews did, they're very, very enterprising people, we know it. They took this little island of Madeira and they cut down most of the trees. The island is called Madeira because Madeira means wood. So they cut down all the trees on the island of Madeira, most of the trees, and they started sugarcane industry. The Jewish people did that on the island of Madeira. So suddenly, sugar is on the market. Europe loves sugar. They fell in love with it. Here comes the Inquisition. I'm not kidding you. Here comes the Inquisition. What's going on this little island here? You Jews are up to something, making money. And so they moved in. They moved in, began to forcibly convert, subjugate, and murder. But what did the Jews do? They hopped the island after Columbus sailed to the west, and a certain Brazilian by the name of Cabral discovered Brazil, Cabral. And Cabral, opened up Brazil to Portugal, to Madeira. Cabral is a very Madeiran name. I have so many friends that are Madeiran Portuguese descendants that are Cabral. So Cabral opened up the entire continent of South America, Brazil, to the Madeirans. And what did the Madeiran Jews do? Sugar cane. And so they get to Pernambuco, which is right there by the Amazon River and all its tributaries, and suddenly they have all the water in the world. What did they do? They took the same sugar mill that they had invented in Madeira, and they built it 20 times bigger. And in the space of 30 years, by 1654, they were producing sugar on a vast scale. And the Dutch, they were not Dutch, they were actually Portuguese or Jews. The Dutch were busy shipping shiploads of sugar from Brazil to Europe. And that's why, still today, the largest sugarcane company in the world is the British Dutch sugarcane, whatever they call it today. They're still around. They're still doing it. So the Dutch and the British had made an alliance based on that Jewish connection that involved sugarcane, also involved piratry. Piratry was lucrative because the Spaniards were the ones who were stealing the gold and trying to get the ships back over to Europe. So it became easy to just hijack these ships and take their gold. But many of the pirates, based on the new history, the new view on history that involves Jamaica, and I'll get there, that history says that many of the pirates were passionate about destroying Spanish galleons and making war against the Spaniards because of the expulsion and because of the Inquisition. Remember that people were dying at the stake by the thousands for being accused of being Jews. If you were forcibly converted like Columbus was as a child, and you were found Judaizing, reverting back to Judaism, you had a good chance of being burnt on the stake or racked. they would take children and they would slit the soles of their feet and pour hot oil on the wound to get them to confess. And many times their confessions were contrived just to be released from the torture. This is what they were doing. So these pirates were exacting revenge. And that's why they were so murderous. And that's what's being written today. That's the new history that's coming. I believe it. I absolutely believe it. And that's why these pirates were so vicious, so murderous. They were vindictive to the Spaniards. And of course, the British benefited from it. And the Dutch benefited from it. Right? They were considered to be, the pirates were considered to be British, but most of them were not British. They were Dutch or Jewish. So after Pernambuco, sugarcane is just being produced on a scale unprecedented in Pernambuco, Recife, the region of Bahia. The region of Bahia. They're just putting out sugarcane. What happens? Lo and behold, the Inquisition comes. All the way up from Rio de Janeiro, they come by land. And this is the most amazing thing. They came by land to ensure that they would root out all, they didn't want to come by sea because the Dutch were governing the sea. They came by land and invaded the region of Bahia, destroyed synagogues, burnt complete synagogues packed with children and women and Jews to the ground, dragged out the leadership, the rabbis in these communities, and burnt them to the stake right in front of their communities. But before they would burn, they would behead. The actual people that did the work of destroying these communities were Moroccans. They were Moroccan mercenaries hired by the Portuguese crown, by the Inquisition, to do the dirty work. This is all recorded in history. So the Moroccans, these mercenaries, and they came by the thousands, had these special swords. They had these very special and very unique swords that were shaped. These swords were shaped like this. However, the Moroccan sword. And with those swords, they beheaded thousands of Jews in Bahia. They burned synagogues flat to the ground, packed with children. This is Brazilian history. This is history. It's called the Dutch-Portuguese War. It wasn't a Dutch-Portuguese war. The Portuguese were the Inquisition, the Roman Catholics, who invaded this Dutch community that were actually Sephardic Jews that were reverting by the thousands, the tens of thousands. All of Recife, all of Pernambuco was Jewish and prospering, doing really well. So put it together. Region of Bahia. Moroccans appear on behalf of the Inquisition with very broad swords. They start burning synagogues down and beheading people. Now, they had very peculiar hats, the Moroccans did. And at the end of their hats, they had a pump. And it was said that to prove to the King of Portugal, who had a representative in Rio de Janeiro, that they were killing the Jews, they would send heads back, and the pumps, as a symbol to say, the pumps dipped in the blood, as a symbol to say that they had accomplished their work. Today there's an organization called the Bahia. Their symbol is a sword and crescent moon. What's sort of, they were Moroccans, the crescent moon, and they're really big on burn victims.
On what?
Burn victims.
Burn. Oh, the Shriners.
They're they're Bahia.
They are Shriners.
Yeah. So figure that out. You look up the history on the Bahia, on the Shriners. It's not as available as it was 20 years ago. You don't get it on the internet. You have to go to the library. You go to the library if you dig deep enough, because a lot of it is shrouded and moved away. It goes back to Brazil. The history of the Bahia movement and the Shriners goes back to Brazil. And what happened in Bahia? They're somehow making amends for their history by taking care of children who are burnt. And so these secret societies, you have to be very careful with them. But that history has been blacked out, didacted from the internet. I personally saw it myself 20 years ago when the internet first came on the scene. I got on there, I spent hours, sleepless nights. What? Downloaded as much as I could, and I have them stored away, the stacks of paper stored away somewhere. Yes, the Shriners, that Bahia religion is about the atrocities that were committed against the people of Pernambuco, Recife, the Jewish people. So what happened? They jumped on ships. Those who were, their city in Recife, Pernambuco, was laid siege by the Portuguese. They were Catholics. And the siege lasted, I think, 2 years. And finally, they got out in ships, Holland, under the Dutch flag. And they went from Pernambuco, Recife, Bahia, to their first stop was Canine, French Guiana. Canine was hostile. They couldn't stay there. The conditions wasn't right. They went to Suriname. What did they find in Suriname? A wonderful river that went deep into the interior of North South America. And they went in vast numbers. Today in Suriname, you have, at the end of that river, almost at the end of that river, the source of it, you have what's called the Judean Savannah. Judean Savannah. It's about 200 years old. There are no Jews there now. It's all inhabited by Amerindians. But the Jewish people fleeing the Roman Catholics went into what is Suriname and established a vibrant community in the Judean Savannah 200 years ago. Suriname was a Jewish country in South America. There's still synagogues today with sand floors in Suriname. You can go and see it. There's still a relatively strong Jewish population in Suriname today. The synagogues are active. It goes back to Pernambuco. It goes back to the Portuguese Jews who fled Recife. They went from Suriname to Guyana, British Guyana. Wasn't comfortable there. Some of them stayed and assimilated completely. They went from there to the island of Tobago, and they hopped over to Curacao. Curacao is very much a Jewish country today. If you want to do business in the Caribbean, you have to go through Curacao, and they're all Jews. They control the sugarcane industry, still today, of the Caribbean. Barbados was settled by the same people. They went from Tobago, Barbados, Aruba, Curacao, and then ultimately Jamaica. And every one of those stops, those sanded floor synagogues were built. There's one in Barbados, the oldest synagogue in the Western Hemisphere in Barbados, sanded floor. Curacao, Aruba, Jamaica. So you can see it. You can see the transition from Pernambuco way out east, around to Canine, Suriname, where they stayed there for a while, Tobago, where they had to hop because the Caribs were eating them. The Caribs were cannibals. So they went from Tobago and to Curacao, Aruba, Jamaica. It's from Jamaica that they started to launch attacks against the Spaniards. It's from Jamaica that they were most successful in sabotaging the Spanish galleons, the fleets that were coming over. Why Jamaica? Because they were going at Central America, the Spaniards were. Jamaica was a great point to ambush these galleons that were heading back to Spain after they destroyed the Mesoamericans and took all their gold. They got tons of gold. Let me say this. It's uncertain just how much gold they got from the Mesoamericans, the Aztecs and the Incas, but they got tons of gold. They were looking for El Dorado. Never found El Dorado, but they got more gold than El Dorado could ever hold eventually. But a lot of that gold was taken, ended up under the British Crown. All right, so Port Royal. Here is the story, and I've never been able to verify this historically. before Port Royal sank, a rabbi who was a part of the Jewish community that was on the island, because the island was very Jewish, on the north side of the island, that community was over there. Most of the Jews settled on the north side of the island for whatever reason. He came over the hill. He came over, and this is the story. He walked over, and he stood on a hill at Port Royal, and he said to the inhabitants of Port Royal that this city is going to sink. Your acts are evil. Your acts are evil before God. Some of the people that lived in Port Royal were Jewish, and he was speaking out. He was like a prophet, this rabbi, they said. And he turned around and he went back over the hill. Months later, Port Royal sank, literally sank to the bottom of the ocean. And I can't verify that story historically, but it happened. It's an amazing thing, right? So you think about that. Port Royal, rich, the richest, at one point it was a richer city than most of the cities in Europe, they were saying. Powerful, because they were just grabbing gold from the Spaniards. Spaniards were killing the Mesoamericans, taking their gold, and they were killing the Spaniards and taking their gold. And it was a cycle, right? A profitable cycle. But they were evil. Port Royal, it was known for its decadence, its stuff, prostitution on a level, all sorts of wickedness. And apparently God determined to destroy it. Yep. And he did. All of the cities sank 20 feet under the ocean. Yes?
Do you know if the Moroccan mercenaries at that time were they Islamic?
They were Muslim, yeah. They were Muslim. They were capable warriors that had a name for themselves, known for being merciless and effective. They were guerrilla types warriors, and they were hired by the Spanish crown, not the Portuguese crown, the Inquisition, to flush out. The Inquisition seemed to follow the money. The times that they would get really interested in what the Jewish people were doing is when they began to become lucrative. Because, of course, in Recife, Pernambuco, by the way, there's a tremendous archaeological effort in Pernambuco today, Recife. And they are uncovering 300-year-old synagogues everywhere in Bahia, everywhere in the city of Pernambuco, the region of Pernambuco, Recife. They're finding mikvahs, baptismal pools. They're finding tremendous cemeteries, Jewish cemeteries everywhere as they dig in the area. Because it was literally a Jewish settlement, and an incredibly powerful, prosperous Jewish settlement. The only time the Inquisition became determined to hire some guns and get up there and take what they had was when they became rich. Because think about it, sugar. They monopolized the sugar industry. They produced a mill that was punching out sugar like crazy. And they had the potential to grow, settle more communities with the same capacity they had all the land they want. They had all the energy they want. The horizon was broad open for them. The Inquisition couldn't let that slide. It's a lot of money, a lot of profit in killing those people, and that's what they did. But the Inquisition has never been very smart. Has never been very smart. Because what they do, and you know where I'm going with this, what they do is they destroy the very economies that they strive to control by destroying the Jewish people. The Spaniards today are opening their borders to the Jewish people, and the Portuguese today. This is very current. In the last 2 or 3 years, the Portuguese government has said, Jews, come back.
Bring your money.
And people like me can become a Portuguese citizen if I can prove my lineage, which I can if I wanted. I don't want to be. And they're doing the same thing in Spain. Why? Because it took the dummies this long to realize that we need our Jews here. We were prospering when they were here. Look at what have become of us. since we've destroyed their communities. Takes them a while to figure it out. So the very thing that the Inquisition wanted to control, they destroyed. Because what did the Jews of Pernambuco do? They took every bit of their technology to the Caribbean. Well, ultimately, sugarcane became open to everyone. By the way, folks, let me say this to you. For at least 100 years, Florida was very, very much controlled by these elements. Sugarcane was really large in Florida in the 1800s, 1700s, and they were controlled by a small group of supposedly Spaniards. They were not really Spaniards. They were not really Spaniards. If you go to St. Augustine and some of the older, like across central Florida on the way to Tampa, you have old communities such as Lisboa, and some of the old-time Florida communities. You begin to see that, wait a minute, there are Portuguese names in these cities, like De Castro, De Sousa. And many of the names associated with these communities are actually Portuguese. How did that happen? You know, we had Lowell Green here. His mother was, one of the old-time Spanish from Florida. And there are many of them around. You can find them in many places in Florida. They're not Spanish. They're actually that same movement that came up from the Caribbean to Cuba, Jamaica, Cuba, and into Florida. And what were they doing? They were looking for safe havens to produce sugarcane and to strive as communities. Ponce de Leon, and this might sound redundant and ridiculous. Ponce de Leon was a converted Jew. De Leon was a very, very common Jewish converso name, a name that you would embrace. Why would De Leon be a very common Jewish converso name? The lion. The lion, of course, we know that they're referring to the lion of the tribe of Judah. The Messiah. The Messiah was always, even in Jewish historiography, the lion was always a representative of the Messiah. So Ponce de Leon and many of the so-called Spaniards, who were not Spaniards, but Portuguese, were actually Sephardic Jews. You go to St. Augustine today, and you get someone who has a little bit of the historiosity, and talk to them. Get a book on the history of St. Augustine, and the port that's built there, and so on. All of the history is there. They would tell you, do you know that actually some of the Spaniards here, they were actually Portuguese? And they would stop right there. I listened to a rabbi who lectured on this. He's from St. Augustine. He's not a part of that, descended from those people. He's Ashkenazi, but lives in St. Augustine. And he made that his passion. And he gives lectures on it. And he would tell you that St. Augustine at one time was a Jewish settlement. Crypto-Jewish settlement. Crypto-Jewish settlement. What happened? They settled it, and then guess what happened after they settled it? There's a huge Roman Catholic church in St. Augustine. You ever been to St. Augustine? You've seen it? That's a monument. Right, that's a monument to the Inquisition. Now, that's not history that you'll get off the bookshelf, but it's actual history, and there are people that will be able to delineate that for you. The rabbi knows about it, and he speaks about it. Now, what happened? St. Augustine became a port where it was about privateering. It was about privateering. It was about piracy. And then the Spaniards, the actual Spaniards, got involved. Because we can't have a town on the east coast of this continent where we're being attacked from regularly. There's a huge inlet, and they're successfully coming after us. The whole Matanza battle, you know, the Battle of Matanza. Get up there, Fort Matanza. Supposedly the French. They weren't French. They weren't French. They were flying under a Dutch flag. They were flying under a Dutch flag. And the history, somehow they became French. Matanza Fort, it's not French. The Spaniards took control of the whole area because they realized that they were being ambushed from that port, Matanza Inlet and the other inlet up in Jacksonville. And the Spaniards took control of St. Augustine and built a fort and said, we're going to fight for this territory because we know something is happening on this land. We know money is to be made. And that's what was happening. The old-time Spaniards that were in Florida were not Spaniards. They embraced Spanish identity, but they were not Spaniards. They were the same people that ultimately came from Madeira, and some of them even from Spain. But they were Jews who were looking for a place to exist, looking for a place to function, to do their business, to do their trade, and to be left alone as Jews. I'm going to say this. For at least 100 years or 150 years in Florida, there have been many Yom Kippurs, Pesachs, Passovers, many festivals and many Shabbats that were celebrated out in the woods of Florida. Many. In the region of DeLand, in the region of Ponce de Leon Springs, all across Central Florida. Many crypto communities remained in hiding, petrified of what was happening in St. Augustine because of that huge Catholic monument, that huge Catholic plug that existed in St. Augustine. They controlled all of Florida, but not enough to completely subjugate what was happening here. Eventually, the whole move. When did Florida become American? 1845. That sounds. That falls in alignment with my historicity. So yes, in the mid-1700s, early 1700s, all the way up to that period, you had all this activity, crypto activity happening here in this Florida state. And from time to time, I would meet people like Lowell Green and other Floridians who would tell you that we've been here for 200 years. We're the original Floridians. And they're right. But they're not Floridians, really. They're originally the people of Israel. The people of Israel who fled Israel more than likely after 70 AD, came across the North African coast, found themselves in Portugal, Spain, Italy. Things got really difficult after Toc da Mata, the great inquisitor, conditioned the Spanish crown and prepared the Spanish crown to go after their Jews. It was Toc da Mata that said to Isabel and Ferdinand that you must get these Jews out of your kingdom at all costs, and the church will help you. You must get them out of your kingdom. In fact, Toc da Mata wanted them all converted, period. And those who would not be converted would be driven out, which happened. So Toc da Mata, Thomas de Mata, whatever his name is, Toc da Mata, succeeded and got Isabel and Ferdinand to agree with him and forcibly convert the Jews, push them out if they don't want to be converted. Many of the Jews, I think 120,000, said, we're not going to convert, we're going to take whatever we can grab. Remember, this is about money.
Yes.
Because the ones who were leaving, you didn't want to convert, well, you got to leave, but with about 10% of what you own, whatever you can carry. About 120,000 of them went over from Spain into Portugal and joined the other population of Jews that had already been there. So Portugal absorbed about 120 Jews from Spain, and their population went from about, I think, 150,000 to about close to 300,000 Jews in Portugal for that period. The population of Portugal at that time was 500,000 together. So the majority of the people in Portugal were Jews, and very active Jews. So what did Portugal do? Portugal decided that it's time to make a deal with Isabella and Ferdinand. They're saying that they would let my son marry their daughter Isabel if I made a pact with them, and the pact was, I'll let you marry my daughter, consolidate kingdoms, if you do something about your Jews. And so John, I can't pronounce his name in Portuguese, John, King of Portugal, said, okay, my son will marry your daughter. We'll have a wonderful kingdom here. We'll put away our differences, which never happened. But we'll have a good union here, and I will convert my convert my Jews and cast them out. Well, he took about 10 years to get around to doing it, but he did. So this 300,000 Jews in Portugal were all one Sunday morning baptized symbolically in effigy. You know, the priests got out there in the streets with holy water and incense, and they pronounced the entire population of Jewish people in Portugal as new Christians. That's what they did. The holdouts, after about 3 or 4 years, the holdouts, they corralled them, brought them into cathedral courtyards, and forced them. Forced them. The ones who continue to revert back to Judaism, well, we just have to burn them to the stake. You know what the Portuguese did? The Catholics did? This is a very sad story. It's a normative aspect of Jewish history. They took 10,000 children, instead of forcibly converting them, and stacked them on ships and sent them off to an island off the coast of Africa, Sao Tome. Sao Tome, I think, is the name of the island. The island is populated today by the descendants of these children. So these ships of 10,000 children, Sephardic Jewish children, were sent off to this island, and the children were just abandoned on the island. There are horrible stories, and you can read about this in Jewish history, of iguanas feeding on them as they dump these ships of children on the island. There are terrible stories of it. They talk about how the iguanas had become so, and they were monitor lizards, huge, not iguanas, they were monitor lizards, huge lizards. That these lizards had become so accustomed to eating the flesh of these children that they will wait for the ships to come in. Now, the descendants of these, I married a couple, and Conrad was his name, and his wife, I can't remember her first name. She was one of these descendants. Very, very dark complected, very African features, but you can see the Portuguese or the Jewish features in her. I married them about 10, 11 years ago. So that's a horrible part of the history of the Inquisition. But it happened. So what happened? Well, the Jewish people said, we're not going to put up with this. And so they left. They left Portugal, Holland, many of them who had the means, Donna Mendes Nasi and so on. The ones who didn't, well, they were simply forcibly converted. Like my family, my ancestry on all sides except on the Diaz side. The Diaz side is very Moranos as well. That's a whole different story. But on the other sides of my family, De Castro, De Sosa, and Franco, and also Mendez, all of them are Portuguese from Madeira, and they were all their ancestry was all Jewish. So they ended up in the New World. The history is so incredible. They ended up in the New World. Brazil, originally the Caribbean, and so on, ultimately made their way up to Florida. The Caribbean had become a hotspot for Moranos activity, but not all of the islands. The Dominican Republic. Anyone here descended from the Dominican Republic? No? Okay. Great-grandmother. So the Dominican Republic, which was called Hispaniola, that was an Inquisition hotspot. That was an Inquisition hotspot. And they did some really cruel things on that little island in sniffing out the Jews and bringing them to trial. They would ship them from Hispaniola to Mexico City. Why Mexico City? Because Mexico City is where they conducted the auto de fe. And at a certain point in the history of Mexican City, with the auto de fe, they were churning them out several a day. Auto de fe is when you burn someone to the stake. Now, the auto de fe was the last resort, right? You know, you go to the stake, you don't want to confess that you're a Christian and that you're going to give up your tendency to be a Jew. then we'll burn you to the stake. But most of the times, people would rot in jails, chained to walls, tortured to death many, many times. Next week, we will look at the history of Luis de Caballel. Luis de Caballel was a conquistador. Came on the 5th trip of Columbus. The 5th trip of Columbus. Luis Caballel. Who was Luis Caballel? He was supposedly a Spaniard, but he was actually Portuguese, you see. Very powerful, very influential. He was given a large swath of land from Texas all the way to California. All of it was given to him. He was that powerful. Given by the Queen of Spain. Luis de Caballel was a Jew, forcibly converted Jew as a child. Within 25 years, from Texas all the way to California, Jewish communities began to spring up like lilies all the way across. Why? Because Luis Caballel, after the Columbus's 5th trip, which he came on, began to sail galleons over to Portugal and other parts of the New World and bring crypto families over, 100 crypto families he brought over initially. And what did they do? Well, folks, Luis Caballel said, folks, it's open plain here. We can go back to being who we are. And they did it in vast numbers. Vast numbers. His own son, Luis Caballel Jr., he has a certain name in Spanish, but Luis Caballel Jr. was burned to the stake together with 20 other Judaizers in Mexico City. Burned to the stake. If you go to a synagogue today, both Ashkenazi or Sephardic synagogue in Tisha B'Av, you know what Tisha B'Av is? That's the anniversary of the destruction of the temple and so on. They go to synagogues and they mourn the Jewish people even today in Tisha B'Av. If you go to most synagogues, even Ashkenazi or Sephardic synagogues, they will read the poem of Luis de Caballel that he wrote the night before he was taken to the auto de fe. They would read it. And maybe next week I can pull it up and we can look at it. The poem that he wrote. Who was Luis Caballel Jr., the one who was burned to the stake together with 20 others? Well, he was the son of Luis Caballel Sr., the conquistador, supposedly, who came over on Columbus's 5th journey. Everywhere Columbus went, these communities cropped up. Cabral did the same thing in Brazil. So from Brazil, Sao Paulo, not Sao Paulo, but from Rio de Janeiro, the entire coast from Rio de Janeiro all the way up to the Carolinas, all the way up to the Carolinas became safe havens. Little dots everywhere. Eventually, what happened in the case with Luis Caballel and that huge slot of land that he was given is the Spanish Inquisition came from Mexico City and began to put pressure on the communities, and the communities became subjugated.